vaccines, we noticed the astonishing statement. Dr. McCullough and I noticed it independently of each other, and we exchanged notes. In April of 2020, Bill Gates came onto his blog and he said, well, you know, the bad news is we're all locked down with this novel respiratory virus, which has emerged and is now sweeping the globe. You know, the good news is we'll all be able to go back to normal when everyone on Earth has received the new vaccine that's being developed. And I thought, that is a remarkable statement. I mean, like, first of all, it's not undergone trials yet.
Right.
It's in development. I mean, you're a major investor in it, but you know, it's in development, and you're already proclaiming that we'll be able to go back to normal when every man, woman, and child on Earth gets it. You know, a remarkable statement from a man who, you know, the Justice Department was claiming in 2000 was the biggest monopolist, you know, biggest antitrust violation, you know, since John Rockefeller.
Wow.
So okay, so that we just thought that's an astonishing thing to say. I mean that implies almost religious faith and the heralded value of this product that's going to not only save mankind but liberate mankind. Because remember, we're all locked down. So once we get the shot, we'll be free, we'll be healthy, we'll be protected. So I began to think that, you know, just as mankind, I think, has these religious archetypes that are always in our mind, I think we are inevitably have something of a religious posture towards the world because there's so many things we don't understand. Yeah. I mean, we're just kind of thrown into this world. We don't really know where we came from. We don't know where we're going. We don't understand why sometimes we're vulnerable. Sometimes we seem to be remarkably robust. There is so much about the human condition that we don't know. And it began to seem to us that vaccines were being perceived as something like a talisman, a kind of, you know, I remember my grandfather served in the U.S. Army in World War II, and he had the St. Christopher medal, and he kept getting wounded in Italy. He actually won a few Purple Hearts, but never mortally. And I remember after the war, he would sometimes ask, I wonder if it was the St. Christopher medal. You know, maybe it was. And he gave it to my mom, and then my mom gave it to other people who were in risky situations. So I think that's how the human mind works. And so we go back. So I said to Dr. McCullough, let's go back to the beginning of this. Let's look at the social, political, economic circumstances in which man fell in love with the concept of inoculation. And let's sort of see how people were talking about it back then. So we start in 1721. There was a smallpox outbreak in Boston, Massachusetts, which at the time was an English colony. And the foremost advocate of this new, at least it was understood to be new in the West, inoculation procedure. They called it smallpox inoculation, or variolation, from the Latin variola, for smallpox. And the idea was, well, you take a small amount of disease-causing matter from the blister or the pustule of someone suffering from smallpox. You make a little incision on a healthy person's arm. You rub some of the infectious matter in the wound. They get a little sick, but they get through the minor illness, and then that seems to render them safe from severe illness. So that was the idea. It's kind of a charming idea. You know, a little bit of poison builds up your immune system against the poison. So we understood why it was a charming idea. But the enthusiasm that we see through the literature was invested in the idea, we believe, was undue. Now, it's interesting that the foremost proponent of variolation in Boston was a very famous Puritan minister named Cotton Mather.
Really?
A lot lot of people know of Cotton Mather. I mean, he was a remarkable figure in early American intellectual history. He was something of a controversial figure because he was a consulting theologian for the judges in the Salem witch trial.
Right.
And so I was rather fascinated by that, his reasoning about so-called spectral evidence in the witch trial. He occupied two realms, just as Sir Isaac Newton did, the natural and the supernatural.
Mm-hmm.
And he thought, well, variolation is a form of ingenuity that is a gift from God. God has given the human mind
Mm-hmm.
the ingenuity to show a path out of this darkness, this dread smallpox.
Mm-hmm.
And so it starts with that. And then we trace the history of inoculation and going into vaccination at the end of the 18th century with Edward Jenner, all the way up to 2021 with Bill Gates's wild enthusiasm for the new generation of messenger RNA so-called vaccines.
So jumping in, what did Jenner do differently, Mr. Leake?
Jenner was a sort of country gentleman doctor. He was a member of the Royal Society because of a paper that he published about the cuckoo bird. Remember, at the end of the 18th century, there was a fascination with nature. They called themselves naturalists, cataloging all of the species of birds and plants and insects. So he achieves some academic credentials with his paper on the cuckoo. He had heard in Gloucestershire, which is a cheese-making, a dairy region of England. We know it from the Cotswolds. It's a very idyllic, lovely countryside with a lot of dairy cattle.
Mm-hmm.
He had heard stories of milkmaids. It's almost like a wives' tale. The milkmaids get blisters on their hands that seem to be transferred from the udders of dairy cattle. Farmers called it cowpox.
Mm.
And the idea was that dairy maids who got cowpox, the idea was when smallpox ripped through town, they seemed to be protected from the far more dangerous smallpox. So cowpox, this is where we get the name vaccine, the Latin word for cow, vacca.
Oh my God, I never knew that.
Yeah. Wow. So Jenner published a pamphlet on the origin of variola vaccinae. So smallpox of the cow.
Oh, wow.
So vaccine literally means of the cow.
Mm-hmm.
And, at first, the Royal Society wasn't particularly impressed by this paper. Mm-hmm. He had guys come back and say, some of the stuff that you're proposing in this paper, it's not very plausible, but make some changes here and make some changes there, kind of sort it out a little bit and then come back. Mm-hmm. The Royal Society, was never entirely convinced, but what he did is he published it in pamphlet form in London, mm-hmm. and then he published successive iterations of it. By the time he gets to the final iteration, I think it was published in 1801, it starts to catch on. And King George IV, or he was the Prince Regent at the time, mm-hmm. Napoleon, Thomas Jefferson in the United States, they read this pamphlet and they think, this sounds pretty fascinating. Mm-hmm. So it becomes this kind of Enlightenment idea. We can apply Newton's laws of gravity and mechanics, motion to the human body and disease. And we characterize this as a misconception. The human body and disease and why we get sick, why some people don't get sick, is far more complex and multifactorial than objects, falling in space.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, that was a fantastic and fascinating précis. But what you've just sketched out is there were parallel, discussions, movements around kind of heroic medicine, leeches, the use of calomel, stopping the use of calomel, I mean, people were groping their way toward what became modern medicine at the end of the 18th, right through the beginning and middle of the 19th centuries. Why did vaccines turn into this all-consuming religious monolith as opposed to the worship of calomel, for instance, which was a once very common treatment for many maladies, which has since fallen into disfavor?
Well, it's a very good question. So if you take virulent measles, as we've discovered, was far more virulent in the American colonies in the 18th century than it is in the 20th century. And there's different reasons that we discuss in our book for why it was more virulent back then. But the point is, you have infectious diseases like measles, smallpox. It's suddenly upon the people, like suddenly. In the case of 1721, there was a ship that showed up in Boston Harbor from Barbados. Some of the crew was infected. There was a poor job that was done at quarantine. Some of the sailors interacted with sailors on the docks, and it got into the city. But it wasn't an understanding of
measles or smallpox.
Smallpox.
Okay.
Smallpox. Now, there was a measles outbreak in Boston in 1713. Very virulent. It killed about half of Cotton Mather's family.
Oh my God.
So it's a very poignant moment in the book where, you understand, why was Cotton Mather keen on immunization? I mean, he'd suffered heavily himself. I mean, he lost 3 of his children and his wife.
Oh my gosh.
So what you see is, okay, this is the way forward. We can render, with this procedure, people will be protected. Now, the observation that we make as we get into the book is the medical mind was strangely obtuse to what the French, later started calling terrain. Like, what are the ecological
Whoa, you guys are getting into the terrain controversy?
Well, I mean, so what does Boston, Massachusetts look like in 1721? It's very poor. It's a poor little British port. It has very long winters. The nutritional status of most of the people in the town is poor. Let's take measles. We now know that vitamin A deficiency correlates with severe measles. You can imagine in the autumn of 1721, people probably weren't getting sufficient vitamin A.
Right.
Long winters. Very poor heating for the urban poor.
Right.
People are kind of freezing all winter.
Right.
So, the human body, if it's well nourished, if it's well rested, if it's not stressed, if it's not freezing to death, it's not drinking sewage water, it's pretty robust.
Right.
But you start to stress the body, it's undernourished, it's cold, it's stressed. Then, suddenly it starts becoming rather susceptible. And, what we discover as we get into the 19th century is the medical mind is sort of inattentive to these other developments. Right. So, we give an example in the mid-19th century. It's only in 1858 that there's this dreadfully hot summer in London. The Thames dries up to virtually nothing. The whole city begins to just stink unbearably of raw sewage. So that's 1858, when finally Parliament, Benjamin Disraeli was the head of Parliament at the time, and some of his statements that have survived, on the parliamentary are so funny. But it's like, only then should we build a sewer? And it's like, well, did you think about that before? I mean, a sewer is a useful thing to have in the largest city on earth. But it wasn't doctors that drove that. There was a doctor named John Snow in the 1850s. He began to think, could it be that cholera that's contaminating groundwater in London, could it be waterborne and it's seeping in from the Thames, which is basically an open sewer? But even with John Snow, like one observant doctor, the medical establishment in London just said, you don't know what you're talking about. Cholera is not waterborne.
Mhm.
It's airborne. It's a miasma.
Right.
So the medical profession is basically just stupid until really you get to the end of the 19th century. And now people start to get the memo about the way things are really working in nature. But what is my point? The enthusiasm for vaccines emerges at this time where vaccines, like, we don't understand anything. We're just oppressed by these infectious diseases, and the vaccine seems to offer hope. It seems to offer protection.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm very happy that you brought up the miasma theory and the story of Jon Snow and the building of the London sewage system by Joseph Bazalgette. It's a very important story. I interestingly tell the same story, or tell this similar narrative in my book Outrages, which came out in 2019, just before the lockdowns. And I don't know if you were noticing what was going on in publishing or media at that time, but my book was actually about something totally unrelated. It was about the first gay rights polemicist in English, John Addington Symonds. But there was this whole chapter on the rise of the idea of the commons of germs, right? And that the solving of the public health problem of infectious diseases by building this sewage system led to what we have inherited, which is this public health metaphor that what you do in your house, I have the right to intervene because you might be infecting me through the commons. Whereas before, the solving of cholera and typhus with the sewage system in London, a man's home was his castle, and there were, filthy, disgusting things going on with sewage in people's basements or in, down the rivulets of the street and so on. But it wasn't seen as a problem that superseded people's privacy and individual rights. So that metaphor of the sewer that connects us all became the metaphor for all of public health and really, government activity subsequently. And the reason I bring this up is that chapter also talks about the beginning of government mandated vaccines, which was, again, a big sociological shift because the government didn't have the right to intervene in your body. Up until then, the government hadn't thought about, forcing a medicine onto people. But the awareness of people infecting people led to some key bills in the 1880s, as I recall, 1870s and 1880s, that forced parents to vaccinate their children. There was great resistance. There was an anti-vax movement way back then. And I'm sure you tell, versions of this story yourself in your book. But the reason I'm bringing this up is my book sustained a very orchestrated smear campaign that led to it being pulped, which has never happened before, not in my career, not in any modern writer I've ever heard of. And I always wondered, what is it about this book? I mean, allegedly there were 2 errors that no one could ever find in the legislative record, but leaving that aside, it was this orchestrated campaign to destroy this book. I'm mentioning that because I think it was that chapter on the resistance to vaccines and the kind of introduction of this public health metaphor that didn't exist prior to that destroyed the idea of, the individual in their home. Anyway, thank you for, narrating that very, very important story of kind of the way we came to change our sense of what our bodies are, from just private, personal, I've got measles, to, the government has to intervene because my measles might affect everybody else. And, sort of Joseph Bazalgette.
I didn't know that you, I think I'd read somewhere that there was some controversy with one of your books, but I didn't realize that the response was that extreme.
Oh, it was crazy. I think AI existed then and it just hadn't been announced because literally the attacks were in the same language all over the world. On this book that nominally was about such a random subject, but that did have that story in it. Anyway, I'll send you a copy, but I'm very, very glad that you're telling that story. It's a very important story for people to know. We didn't always, think about public health the way we do now. The other thing I want to go back to, John Leake, is what you said, which is so profound, about the kind of tunnel vision that medical doctors have, especially now. And you're making me think of another important figure in the 19th century, which is Florence Nightingale, who kind of invented the modern notion or profession of nursing. And she was a privileged woman who needed a job, needed something to do. And she embraced the opportunity to go out to where soldiers were suffering horrible infectious diseases, gangrene, dying in the Crimean War. And she wasn't a medical doctor. She barely had any medical training, but she noticed that they got better exposed to sunlight and fed well and good hygiene. So I guess I'm bringing that up because doctors are not trained to notice the terrain, right? Is this soldier dirty? Is the water dirty? Is there enough sunlight reaching this part of the ward? That's not their brief. And so I want you to talk about this part of your book now. So I'm sure what you're going to say now is improvements in hygiene and sanitation and nutrition led to the drop in infectious diseases that people mistook as magic from vaccines. But I'm just noting that it's like non-doctors who notice.
It's true. I mean, we talk about just a social reformer who apparently was genuinely animated with feelings of improving human welfare in London, who he wasn't even a doctor. He was a lawyer, and he was the commissioner for it was a parliamentary commission for just improving the lot of the urban poor. He was the one that first started saying, well, no, wait a minute. I mean, things are awfully dirty. Maybe I had to pull together some doctors and get them to focus. What do you guys think about all the sewage? Could that be a problem, fellas? And so it wasn't even a doctor that started this.
And so who was that? It was Henry Mayhew, right?
Edwin Chadwick, I believe.
Oh, right, the Chadwick Report. Yep, that's him.
Right. Yep. Right. So, Florence Nightingale. I mean, part of that, I think, was that she was just a thoughtful person who had not been dehumanized by military discipline. I mean, my great whatever grandfather on my father's side was a surgeon in the Confederate Army.
Wow.
And his diaries have survived. My grandmother had them. I read them when I was a little boy.
Wow.
And he talks about what a horror show these field tents were in the aftermath of a big battle. And he was apparently something of an educated man. And he said, the lowest circle of hell in Dante's Inferno, really can't describe just the screams, just the agony. And really all the military surgeons were really trained to do is just amputate just as fast as you can. I mean, and he talks about just piles of human limbs.
God.
So she shows up at this military hospital in Turkey, and they're bringing all these poor devils in from Ukraine. And she's just like, God, these poor guys. I mean, it's just appalling conditions. And the military guys are just like, well, that's what it's like being a soldier. If you don't like it, man up. And she's like, no, wait a minute. These are human beings after all. Maybe we should try and improve the conditions of the field hospital. And so her observation was cleanliness. I mean, Joseph Lister was coming on around the same time, and she had this idea, antiseptic. Maybe if we keep things cleaner, it would prevent things like putrefaction and gangrene and these dreadful things, which just result in amputation. Wow. So a human limb is actually worth saving.
Right. Amazing. So a number of things were sort of coming together at once. So then could you fast forward with your thesis of the book, talk about that intersection, I guess, in the early 20th century between and middle of the 20th century drops in childhood death from some of the severe diseases and the attribution of that to vaccines. And then lastly, I really want you to expand on why you're bringing up the role of terrain now, which is such a controversial thesis.
Well, so I just began to wonder, and I asked Peter, I said, have you ever just looked at the U.S. vital statistics, which going all the way back to the 30s are very detailed on infectious disease mortality? Like, let's just how many children died of pertussis, of diphtheria, and then you just go back and you look at U.S. vital statistics. It has the cause of death, and you just see this just plummeting. Diphtheria, I think the worst year on record for diphtheria was 1921.
Right. Wow.
By the time you get to 1946, which is 2 years before the DPT vaccine is recommended for all American children by the American Academy of Pediatrics. By the time you get to 1946, I mean, you're talking about just over 1,000 deaths attributed to diphtheria. Well, I mean, there were 10 times more children killed in a car accident that year. So these things, infectious disease mortality, diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, measles, mumps, rubella, I mean, they'd all completely precipitously declined before the modern vaccine schedule.
So to what you owe that, Mr. Leake?
I mean, it's improvements across the board. I think we moderns, I mean, there you are in an apartment in Brooklyn. I'm in an apartment in Dallas. I mean, we forget that, in the old days, most people were poor. They didn't get enough nourishment. They didn't get enough both calories and vital nutrients.
Right.
They're cold in the winter. In London, for example, which was the biggest city in the world, they called it London fog, coal smoke.
Right.
I just thought, well, what were the rates of bronchitis before they started replacing coal with coal gas lighting, with gas lighting?
Right.
And I mean, like, everybody had bronchitis in London.
Totally.
So, I mean, and then you look at infectious diseases that there's just never been a vaccine at all. I mean, tuberculosis is a notable one.
Right.
I mean, by the time you get to around 1948, so let's just intersect tuberculosis with these other diseases. By then, you'd had the introduction of antibiotics. I think it was in 1953 that a new antibiotic was found to be very, very effective against tuberculosis. So tuberculosis begins to precipitously decline. I mean, just take any infectious disease. And so housing, nutrition, sanitation, food hygiene. One of the things that really surprised me, I'd never really thought about this until I got into the research. There's a certain percentage of mothers that just simply in the 19th, probably going all the way back, but all the way up to the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, they did not produce sufficient milk to nurse their infants.
Right.
Okay. So what do we do about it? Well, if you're in New York City in the year 1906, you're not producing enough milk to nurse your infant and you're poor. You live in an Irish tenement building. Will you go buy milk from the local dairy? Like, in the Bowery of Manhattan, literally there's dairies. Okay?
Right.
They were absolutely filthy.
Right.
So let's clean up the dairies, like just staggering in mortality from dirty milk.
Right.
And then pasteurization of milk comes on. I think it was the year 1914 that Chicago said, okay, look, we're going to have to clean up the dairies and we're going to have to pasteurize milk. New York does it in 1917, I think. So these things that we don't even think about anymore, just basic food hygiene in the case of milk, and it's dramatically reduces infant mortality.
Wow. And so, sure enough, that drop in infant mortality was, it sounds like, jumped on by commercial interests in the post-war years by pharma. And they told the story of these injections being the cause, essentially, of those childhood diseases going away, as opposed to better heat, better sanitation, cleaner air, better food, and so on.
Well, the response that you're going to get is that, particularly with measles, mumps, and rubella, these viral diseases, measles being extremely contagious. I mean, remember, all American children got measles, mumps, and rubella before. I mean, you were presumed to have had the illness prior to the introduction of the vaccines in the 60s.
Right.
So the first thing I would observe is, if you listen to public discourse today, you would believe that measles is a sort of devouring killer of children.
Insane.
It's not. If you look at vital statistics between 1952 and 1962, a decade prior to the introduction of the measles vaccine, measles mortality had already so precipitously dropped. The case fatality rate was already less than 1 in 1,000. And that 1 out of 1,000, oftentimes it was a child with other sickness, a sickly child. The other thing about measles is, oftentimes what kills a child of measles is not the measles itself, it's a secondary bacterial pneumonia, which, if you're paying attention, if you're a doctor worth your salt, you could prescribe antibiotics for that quickly. This little girl out in West Texas, she didn't get antibiotics. Started to develop pneumonia. It was detected on a Monday. No antibiotics prescription.
Horrible.
So the pneumonia becomes severe. She's hospitalized, but by then, it's already severe. So, regarding measles, mumps, and rubella, the response from the pro-vaccine crowd is, well, there was still high. Never mind mortality. They might concede that from just hard data, but the morbidity was still high. Like, every child used to get measles, and they'll tell me, Mr. Leake, you didn't get measles because you were vaccinated. So I'm going to concede that. The question now, with like measles, mumps, rubella, and this whole other battery of vaccines on the schedule, is this hyper vaccination that's really come on strong since 1986, since the passage of the Childhood Vaccine Injury Act granting liability protection. Since then, we've seen a proliferation of shots on the schedule. Now children are just being blasted with all of these antigens and adjuvants. That, on the timeline, produces a very suspicious correlation with spiking rates of autism.
Wow, that's so great.
Okay, so here's the thing. Autism has been redefined as a spectrum, and way out on the kind of positive bell curve of the spectrum is some quirky genius like Elon Musk, who, we're not going to worry about Mr. Musk. What we're worried about is about 27% of children who are diagnosed with autism that have what we call profound autism.
Oh my God.
They're profoundly disabled. They don't have speech. They can't be toilet trained. They're given to crazy outbursts. They bang their heads on the headboard. They require round-the-clock care, apparently for the rest of their lives.
Oh my God.
So, if you go by the CDC's own data, their own estimates on this, about 27% of all children diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, 27% are profound autism. Okay. That comes to about 275,000 American children that require around-the-clock care for the rest of their lives.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So what is causing that?
Yeah.
What's causing it? And you listen to some of these CNN doctors, and they'll say, well, we don't know what's this is what they say. We don't know what's causing it. We just know it's not vaccines, which I think is an obvious logical fallacy. That's fallacious reasoning. If you don't know, you don't know.
Can I just jump in as a non-scientist and non-physician? It's just common sense. You think of the technology of a vaccine, of a syringe. If you're pumping 86 units of anything with adjuvants into a tiny person's body, and that circulates through the bloodstream and crosses the blood-brain barrier, there's going to be brain damage. How can we imagine that there wouldn't be?
Well, so I think that the observation is just common sense. We have a chapter in our book. It's called Intrigue in the Vaccine Court. And there was this it's called the Autism Omnibus Proceedings. And it's like, surprise, surprise, there's like 5,000 pairs of parents who, by the time you get to the year 2000, are like, there's something wrong with our children. And that something seemed to have emerged suspiciously around the time that they got a big battery of shots. So the Autism Omnibus Proceedings was, they put all of them in this vaccine court, which was established by the Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986 as a kind of compensation court for parents whose children have been injured. What they do is they say, okay, like there's 5,000 complaints. Like, we can't adjudicate all of these. So what we'll do is we'll take 3 test cases and we'll have testing of these cases in order to ascertain if there is a causal link at all. And if there's not a causal link demonstrated by our test cases, then we're going to tell all of these parents to go jump in a lake. So we'll start with the test cases. Okay, so they get into this. It's one of the most intriguing moments in it's like a mafia thriller, okay? So I won't go into all of the details, but what emerged in all of this was there was a plaintiff, a man named Dr. John Poling, who was a neurologist at Johns Hopkins University. His daughter, medical center. His daughter, he had published in the peer-reviewed paper how she received a bunch of vaccines and she regressed into autism. Profound. Okay. That was published in the peer-reviewed literature. It comes to the attention of the special masters of the vaccine court that Dr. Poling is one of the plaintiffs. So they say to him, let's just take you aside. Let's do a side deal with you. We'll concede to you, Dr. Poling, that your daughter Hannah was injured by the vaccines and there is a causal link with autism. But we're going to do it secretly. We'll compensate you and your wife.
Oh my God.
Shove off. And then with the test cases, they all say, well, there's no connection with autism, blanket categorical statement. All of you other, plaintiffs, go away.
Wow.
So Poling then has the conscientiousness to realize what's happened here. They did a side deal with me, so they didn't have to acknowledge this in public. So he goes public and writes an op-ed in the New York Times. This is 2008.
Right.
And immediately this complex of vaccine commercial interest, they sick Dr. Paul Offit.
Oh, the attorney, Dr. Offit.
Writes this counter op-ed, which is just annoying to read. You're just making a bunch of assertions, invoking his authority as the great Dr. Paul Offit. And we quickly forget about the Hannah Poling case. But there are cases in which the United States government has conceded the link, but they're swept under the rug. So we support Robert Kennedy's stated objective. He's going to try and get to the bottom of this. Now, he's up against the biggest mafia ever erected, the most devious, well-capitalized, with the phalanx of attorneys, running interference all the time. So I don't know. I mean, I wish him the best of luck. But he's up against a pretty formidable array of power.
Yeah. Yes. It's very true. Can I ask forgive the, ignorance of this question, but, you started this conversation describing what I understood, from middle school to be what a vaccine is, which is, you described it so well, a little bit of infectious matter from, that could make someone very sick, injected into someone to elicit an immune response to that infectious matter and make them slightly sick, and then they're immune, right? But are modern vaccines even that? Like, I don't think that the COVID vaccine had any actual biological infectious matter from a COVID virus. And I know that if you get into the weeds here, there are people who argue that no one's ever identified the COVID virus. So I don't know if you want to weigh in on that. But are like those 86 shots poor kids get in order to go to school, how many of them are the actual biological infectious matter, per Edward Jenner, per the end of the 18th century, that are triggering a real immune response?
Well, most of them are so-called inactivated. Either they've been killed by heating, or with going back to the Jonas Salk vaccine with formaldehyde, or they're in some way attenuated. There's a process for weakening them. So either inactivated or attenuated.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, this is important. I mean, it would be one thing to subject an infant to one dose of an attenuated measles virus,
mm-hmm.
or polio virus,
mm-hmm.
with an adjuvant. But if you're going to hit the child with all of these inactivated or attenuated viral or bacterial pathogens all at once with adjuvants to stimulate the immune system,
mm-hmm.
our concern is that this, and it was Dr. Polling's concern, is that mm-hmm. this is creating a strong immunological response, an inflammatory response that may be causing inflammation of the brain.
Well, and we see it not just autism, sorry to jump in, but asthma, allergies, autoimmune stuff, all these inflammatory conditions that kids have now.
Right. So, I mean, I'll just give you another example. So pertussis, it's a bacterial infection. It's like a violent coughing bronchitis caused by, it's called the Bordetella pus, the pertussis bacterium. Okay, so it is treatable with antibiotics. Mm-hmm. I mean, the coughing can be protracted and even rather convulsive, but it is treatable. So that gets into a risk-benefit analysis with the original pertussis vaccine. It's called the whole cell pertussis vaccine. And there's no question about it. I mean, the vaccine industry itself in Sweden and Japan and other jurisdictions observed this does seem to be causing, and it's a relatively small percentage, but over a large population, it's a lot of kids, febrile seizures, where the child runs a very high fever, has seizures, and then there were documented cases of brain damage from the whole cell pertussis vaccine. Mm-hmm. So the Japanese in the 1970s said, can we come up with a safer pertussis vaccine? So the acellular pertussis vaccine was developed in Japan. Now, the Swedes for 17 years said, the pertussis vaccine seems too dangerous. I mean, let's just remove it from the schedule. Mm-hmm. In that 17-year period, there were 3 deaths attributed to pertussis in Swedish children. 17 years, 3 children. 2 of those had severe congenital abnormalities. Wow. 17 years, 1 death in a purportedly normal child attributed to pertussis, in 17 years without it. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, what we argue that we should do is get out of the business of orthodoxy and heresy, mm-hmm. and take vaccines back into the realm of just critical discussion and evaluation.
Right. Well, what a timely call. And you anticipated my last question, which is like, what is the mission of this book? What do you and Dr. McCullough want people to take away? Is it that, like, to stop mythologizing these injections and just demystify them and talk about them in cold, hard facts? Is there more to it?
It's a good question. I'm glad that you're asking. So what we want to do, what we observed is that the whole endeavor, the whole enterprise of vaccines, it has been more in the realm of metaphysics, orthodoxy, and heresy than it has been in the realm of science.
Totally.
Anthony Fauci always said, follow the science. We follow the science. I am science. He actually invoked papal infallibility. He said, I am science. Right. It's not that I'm good at doing the scientific method. I am the personification of science. So we need to get away from that. Anthony needs to, I don't know what he needs to be doing. I think he's at Georgetown, but he needs to study religion or something. And we need to take the whole enterprise back into the realm of just critical discussion.
Fair enough. You heretic, you.
Yes.
You and Dr.
I am a heretic. I am. A lot of interesting guys in history have been branded heretics, so I think I'm in good company.
You're in very good company historically. I was just going to wrap up by saying, and I could talk to you and no doubt Dr. McCullough about this for hours. It's so fascinating, and we have a nice big audience listening live, and more people will be listening as the podcast gets edited and sent out in the future. But I watch your and Dr. McCullough's careers with astonishment, because Dr. McCullough is so credentialed and you are so well educated, and nothing either of you says is without abundant documentation. And it just, as someone who's kind of come of age professionally in the same world that you and Dr. McCullough did, of like, well, if you can back it up, it's not lunacy, right? It's fascinating for me to see such kind of mainstream thinkers and people of accomplishment so the effort's so great to marginalize you both. The beauty is you have stood firm for years now, and far from being marginalized, you're now the dominant culture. Dr. McCullough is the dominant hero of the medical freedom movement of doctors, and they didn't silence you. So I just wanted to note that there are people in our movement who are like just making things up or have one source or only thought about this yesterday, but you and Dr. McCullough are so like established, and your work is so grounded. So I just want to thank you for that. Like as someone who has loved academia and loved the scientific method and loved good nonfiction with citations, I really want to appreciate how well cited your work and Dr. McCullough's work always is. And I also want to thank you for writing such a readable book. I literally couldn't stop reading the manuscript. It was, and again, there are many books about the subject that you want to kill yourself 3 pages in, but it's so engaging. It's so readable. It's so important. I think this is a book that's going to be taught in universities for a century to come, if there's any justice. You've really done a great thing for the record and for the history of humans in relation to disease. I encourage everyone to go to Skyhorse or go to Amazon and order Vaccines, Mythology, Ideology, and Reality by John Leake and Dr. McCullough. And where do people find you? Anything else that they can do to support you and Dr. McCullough?
Well, we're particularly keen for people to buy our book. So the easiest way is just to go to Amazon. The other place you can find us, and by the way, the Holy Office of the Inquisition, i.e. Google, and it was in Rome, but now it's in Mountain View, California, is where the Holy Office is now set up shop. Our focalpoints.com newsletter site, Google has branded it using, I believe, in a foreign jurisdiction. I believe it's in Portugal. It's called Spam House. So our Focal Points newsletter has been somehow, I don't know exactly how the code works, but it has been flagged as spam.
Oh my God.
So, I mean, I don't, President Trump did issue an executive order saying that you can't do this kind of violation of the First Amendment. Right. So I don't know where we're going to go with that. But anyway, the focalpoints.com, although it is apparently been flagged as spam by Google, you can nevertheless punch it into your type the URL, the focalpoints.com.
I'm sorry, can't people subscribe to it and get emails?
Yes, they can. Okay. They can. And I don't know exactly how that spam flag works, but I mean, we have noticed there seems to be something that's kind of hindering the dissemination of our newsletter, but you can find it and you could subscribe to it. Thefocalpoints.com.
Fantastic.
It's our daily newsletter.
Is Courageous Discourse no longer where people should go?
It is. What happened with Courageous Discourse was the name seemed more suitable of a time where Dr. McCullough was really just under heavy machine gun and heavy artillery fire just every day. I mean, just sticking your head above the parapet, risk getting it blown off. You know, we kind of have moved from being dissidents to more just conventional investigative reporting.
Well, it's the best, whatever you call yourselves. There's no one better creating important content. I want to end with a great quote by one of our listeners, Hans Stein. One of the great follies of medicine is their desire to find one thing for all. They never cared much for the individual out of hubris and arrogance. That's why they always loved statistics, and that's why they tamper with statistics. And so you have been a counterweight to that. I'm going to let you go, but everyone, seriously, you need to order this book and you need to support these writers, you know, and the investigators, as I always say, you get the culture you pay for, you get the culture you support. If you want big legacy media telling you lies through AI, don't support the independent writers and commentators. If you want people like John Leake and Dr. McCullough who have, you know, I'm just going to say this, you don't have to, John Leake, being an independent investigator, independent commentator is very expensive these days. It takes legal advice. It can take cybersecurity. It can take, you know, staff. It takes a huge amount of effort to roll this material into the public sphere. People like John McCullough people like Dr. McCullough and John Leake don't have, you know, Random House with a team of publicists. You have to support them. You have to support this book. There's nothing more important than to send that $30 or $40 to Amazon to get this book. And it also helps them because it teaches the algorithm on Amazon, this is a book that's selling, and then it auto-populates, you know, to other people's feeds. So it's up to you. I'm going to stop haranguing you, but I really mean it. Okay. And John Leake, thank you for another fantastic book. Thank Dr. McCullough in absentia, and you know, best of luck. And we're here to showcase this in any way we can.
Thank you, Dr. Wolf. I appreciate it. You're most kind. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.